welcome to the Coding with AI podcast, where we have conversations with humans who build apps using AI. I'm Marcelo Lewin, your host and the founder of iCode with AI. If you want to get a hold of me, just send me an email, marcelo@icodewith.ai, not .com, but .ai. Now, today's episode is going to be really interesting. I'm actually interviewing Eric Provencher. He's the founder of Repo Prompt. It's a tool that I actually started using a while ago. And I'm glad he decided to come on board to have a chat. And for those of you that do a lot of vibe coding, you notice that code isn't at the center of your vibe coding. It's everything else. So that's what we're asking today is code a thing of the past in vibe coding? So we're going to have that conversation with him. But before we get started, I want to remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click that bell icon to get notified when a new episode is out. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and hit the like button. If you didn't, send me an email and tell me why. Now, without further ado, let's get Eric here. Eric,
Hey,
welcome. Glad to have you here. Thank you for being.
Yeah,
you are
yeah,
in Canada, correct?
Montreal,
Right.
yeah.
Yep, Montreal. I'm in Southern California, so you're what, 3 hours ahead from me.
Yeah, that's right. 6 p.m. here.
Yeah.
Been a busy
Now,
day.
a busy day. Yeah, with all the announcements from OpenAI, ChatGPT 5, and if people are watching this, 2 weeks from now, there's ChatGPT 7 already, probably. Who knows? But before we get started, just give us a quick overview of your background. Like I mentioned, you are the founder of Repo Prompt. Just give us a quick, how did you get into computers, AI, and all that stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that got me into programming while back when I was in high school was working on games. And so, I worked on a game early on, and then it really set my trajectory to go into engineering and went to computer science. So, after school, I decided to look into VR. I was like really interested in the space, and so I was working on that for a while. I did a lot of my career at Unity, working on XR interaction, and later through that, I started working on a game for the Vision Pro, and I was working with Claude Opus at the time, and I was just not super impressed with the tools available for like getting Claude access to the code that I was working on and then applying the edits after. At the time, Cursor was super primitive. A lot of other tools didn't exist. All these Claude codes didn't exist. So I started working on my own app, and I think I found ways to keep it relevant there, and I just keep using it to build this app. And so I've just working on this full time now, and it's quite an experience.
That's really cool. Now, I was actually into VR a long time ago. I had a website called howtocreatevr.com, which
very cool.
and that I ended up getting acquired, and it was all about VR stuff. So I probably, tested some of your stuff that you created back then. So very cool. Were you going to say something?
Well, I was just gonna say, if you used anything with Unity, like you might have had anything, like the app might have touched my work in some way. Like, especially if there's hand tracking involved, that was my specialty. So.
Oh, that's very cool. Very cool. So you're always on the forefront of stuff, of technology.
I try, yeah. I'm driven by my curiosity to try new things and experiment, and I work on products and projects kind of following the scientific method. Like I try things, I have a hypothesis, I experiment, I try, it fails, I try again, and I kind of iterate that way. And so it kind of has led me pretty well so far. And I think with AI, especially now, like it's just so much easier to test hypotheses and just see where they go and follow them.
That sounds a lot like vibe coding, actually. Right?
You can have different ways of looking at it, but yeah, sure. I mean, it's definitely
well, we're going to talk about that, actually. We're actually going to jump into that. You created the app, the Repo Prompt. Did you start vibe coding that to get an MVP, or did you hand code it, traditional coding?
So my first prototype was like fully vibe coded. Like I didn't it was like fully like that. I didn't really know the best ways to use AI at the time. I was just trying things. But then that prototype, like it wasn't going to scale, and I scrapped it completely. And then I took a more structured approach. But I think over time, my way of working with it has kind of I've still followed, like I know what the code is doing, and I'm like reading it, but I'm like the code is being written more and more by AI, and at this point, it's like very largely AI written. But the way I prompt it and the way that I structure what I'm working on, that's kind of this whole sauce in how I work with AI to get that output. So yeah, but I think the whole thing is I'm still always aware of like I still feel like the code is there. Like you mentioned earlier, like, is the code like everything but the code? But like, for me, like that's a whole part of how I prompt it as well. So we'll get into that too for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So for a software engineer that hasn't touched vibe coding at all, right? And
Mhm.
explained a person with that mindset, what is vibe coding and how
Mhm.
is it different from traditional software engineering?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start with traditional engineering just so you get a sense of that, because I think that's coming further and further away from people, especially if you're listening to this. Like, you might be like, okay, well, what is actual engineering anymore? Well,
Right.
what it is like you have to sit down and like think through like all the logic yourself. You have to think through like, okay, what is my code doing? Like, is it going through this function? Oh, I have to manage my memory. I have to, think through like the whole flow of the program, and then so you have to think about architecture, you have to think about how pieces are talking to each other, and then you get to the output at the end, but you have to sit down and think about it first. Whereas with vibe coding, you think about the outcome, and then you let the AI take care of the rest to get to that outcome. And sometimes it works great, and you get like a usable thing. But then often what happens is, you get to a thing and you're like very excited, and then you want another thing and another thing and another thing, and then all of a sudden it stops working and you don't know why, and that's when the challenges start to arise.
Right, right. And that's where you start. That's when you need to bring some of that software engineering, structured programming mindset into vibe coding, right? So that
Hmm.
stuff doesn't happen, which we'll touch upon. But one thing I've noticed, I started my career many years ago, 30 plus years ago, as a developer. I moved way away from development. So, but vibe coding brought me back into it, right? But it's a different kind of development. And one thing I've
Hmm.
noticed is when I used to develop, right, the code was right there in the middle, and that
Hmm.
was my focus.
Hmm.
And what I've noticed now is that my chat is in the middle, right, with my
Hmm.
documents, and then the code is like a little window on the side that I will
Hmm.
jump into once in a while to check out, but most of the time. Do you find that to be true for you as well?
I would say like the way I code with AI, like maybe as I'm like starting off a task, I won't be looking at it. But then what I do look at a lot is the diffs, and I use an app called Git Kraken quite a bit. It's my Git GUI, and I spend so much time looking at diffs, and I think that's the code that I look at a lot of time is the changes from one task to the next, and so I am looking at the code, but not in an editor so much as
The
in a
diff.
review. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, that's how what I do as well is when it asks
Hmm.
me, I'm about to make this change, I look at the diff, I'm like, okay.
Hmm.
Um, and I do it for a couple of reasons, and I'd love to know why you do that. But for me, it's making sure I understand what's going on in there. And it's also, for me, it's a learning lesson as
Hmm.
well. It's
Absolutely.
understanding why it did make those changes. I may even prompt it later and go like, "Why did you make
Hmm.
that change?" So I can understand better. But
Hmm.
why do you go back and verify versus just vibing and going with the flow?
Well, one of it is I do find that I need to have a handle on the architecture, especially as I'm working on an app that is touched by thousands of people. Like I want them to have a bug-free experience, and I want to understand as well, like when something does break, where it broke and why. So I need to understand how it works, and maybe and like there's some things in the code where like I'll ask like O3 Pro or like some crazy model, and it'll write an algorithm that I might not fully understand, but I'll write some tests around it, and then I'll make sure that I like have a good handle on it. But then I can still read through a lot of it, and I'll understand. Okay, like there's concurrency patterns, like this thing is talks to this, and how does that happen? Where is it going around there? Like I'll notice like Claude will make some code, and I'll be like, that pattern is dangerous. Like I don't trust that pattern. I'm writing in Swift, and Claude will make some sloppy changes, especially around concurrency, and then so I catch those things and I try to stop it from doing these patterns that I don't like. So it's a mix of reasons like that.
Now, I love that you said that because you obviously are a coder and you can catch
Hmm.
these things, right? But let's say
Hmm.
for the majority of Vive coders are not going to be software engineers, at least right
Hmm.
now. The majority are more technical professionals that are not
Hmm.
developers, right? So they're creating tools for themselves. They're in the marketing team. They're in
Hmm.
whatever other team creating a product manager can now do an MVP, right? Without going to a
Hmm.
developer just to prove the concept.
For sure.
Um, what's your recommendation for them starting to understand
Hmm.
that framework, right? Because I always tell people you don't need to know the code, But if you're working on a framework, you need to understand the high level of it at a
Mm-hmm.
minimum to understand what's going on. What steps can a non-developer take to do what you did, which is,
Mm-hmm.
wait, AI, this looks cool, it's working, but it's not going to be working for too long.
Yeah. I think I mean you can prompt the models, especially as you're working with them, to try and explain their reasoning as they go through. And I think it's important to ask questions, regularly often. What is unfortunate though with the way that models work with their context windows is that if you're stopping the model every time to explain what it's doing, you're going to burn up your context window and you're not going to be as productive and it's not going to be able to ship as good code, which is unfortunate. Some tools, like Repo Prompt does have chat forking, so you can fork the chat and then start asking questions about it at that point. I think that's a really good practice to get into, like just asking questions. One thing I'll also say is that it's good to understand, like what file at least does what. You don't have to understand like each function, each down like piece, but like try to keep like a high level structure of like where in your code is responsible for what functionality, and so that you can kind of just keep a handle on it. And especially as you're managing context, you can remember like, oh well, that feature is managed over here, and you could point the AI in the right spot at least. And yeah, and making it also write documentation, like that's really helpful as well. Just being able to just read through what it says it's doing anyway. Sometimes models will hallucinate that stuff, but it's good to still read through it, and understand what's happening. So reading a lot is the biggest thing, I'd say. Just reading what's written. Don't just like check out and go like go outside and come back in and then just be happy with it.
Right.
Like you should be
Be
involved and
involved.
engage with what's
Exactly.
happening.
Yeah, exactly. I found that to be true. Now, you mentioned documentation, but I see two types of documentation.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is a documentation for you to understand what's going on. That's very important. But
Mm-hmm.
also, there is the other type of documentation for the AI to understand the project. Because one of the
Mm-hmm.
frustrations that I have sometimes is, and there's ways of getting around this, is you work on a feature, you push it to production, everything's cool, then you shut down for the day and you come back the next day and you start, and it's like talking to a new employee that just got hired,
Mm-hmm.
has no clue about your code. So you have to
Mm-hmm.
go through the process again. So what tips do you
Mm-hmm.
have for that?
Mm-hmm. I think, well, there's something that I've been pushing a little bit more, especially as you're working with agents. It's called like context priming. So your initial task, your initial prompt, I think it should be detailed. It should include like enough information about like what your task is, information about your code base, how it's structured, where to look for certain things. You want to be able to spoon feed the model information, but if you're working with an agent, you want it to be able to go find the information that it needs and not have to look around too much. So being able to like prime the agent with the right uh, where to navigate, just the navigation map of like what to find, what information. If you're using kind of a more traditional flow of like just talking to a chat bot, like you should like try and grab context if you can and organize it and try and give it a lot for your question. Like a lot of the time when I was working on Repo Prompt, agents didn't exist or they weren't helpful. And every query involved grabbing my file context, my question, and then pasting a huge prompt. And that came with implicit understanding of what was happening. Like models, what I find as well, especially as you get to reasoning models, they are very good at learning from the patterns in your code. So if you have good patterns that you develop over time, the model is able to follow them. But if you have poor patterns, they will kind of keep following those poor patterns and kind of continue the slop. So
Let's
yeah.
talk a little bit on patterns for
Hmm.
non-developers, right? Explain, what do you mean
Hmm.
by patterns, and how can
Hmm.
non-developers start implementing patterns in their code, in their
Hmm.
project?
Yeah, well, I mean, patterns like if you're new to software engineering, there's all kinds of patterns you can follow. One that's very popular that a lot of folks follow is like splitting up your view from your data and your logic. So you have like your logic, your data, and your view. And if you try and bundle everything together in the view, you get slow views and it doesn't render very well. If you try and put too much like data in there as well, then you might get like, especially if there's asynchronous stuff, something called a race condition, which causes like data to get corrupted as multiple parts of the code try to touch it. So trying to segment things out is very helpful. There's all kinds of patterns to follow, but like a lot of them are really so that the human can kind of better understand what is happening and makes the code less kind of overwhelming to look at. But a nice side effect is that like AI models are trained to think a lot like humans do because of the training data. So if it's easy for a human to understand what's happening, it's generally easier for a model to understand as well. Um, Yeah. So, and there is another thing too to keep in mind is that like AI models, they're kind of a snapshot of a moment in time when they're shipped, and they can access tools to kind of fetch information, but then that will use context under limited context window. And so you want to try and find ways to make sure that the model, like reading your code, is not trying to implement things that it doesn't understand. So if you're using like a bleeding edge framework that the model's never seen before, it's going to make a lot of mistakes, so you need to give it sufficient documentation to work on it. But then the more code that exists, the more it sees the patterns, the less it needs to understand the documentation or read it every time to make changes, because it can see the patterns elsewhere.
So stick to a framework that is better known because it's better known also. It's kind of like if you have a million developers that know
Mm-hmm.
Next.js versus developers that less developers that know a different framework, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have a bigger pool of people you can choose from. Same with the AI, right? The AI will
Exactly.
understand things without having to add more to the context.
Yeah, so like it's kind of unfortunate, I feel like, in a way, because a lot of AI models are trained on like dated information. Like GPT-5 just came out and its knowledge snapshot ends in October of 2024. So it has no knowledge of anything that came after it. And even up to 2024, it might have limited knowledge of what happened that year because there's not that much there. Like a lot of these models are trained on GitHub, and the more examples of a framework that exists on GitHub, the more the model will be good at using it properly. And that's why, like, if you see, like, Python models are incredible. Python models are really good at TypeScript. They're very good at React. They might be less good at Next.js. They might be less good at other frameworks as well, like Svelte. So sticking to things that were very popular for a long time on GitHub, that's where you're going to get the best results. And it's a bit of a challenge too, because you want to evolve, but like the models don't. So.
Right, and that's one of the sort of the drawbacks sometimes to that,
Hmm.
right? Is that you can be on the bleeding edge. Well, you can, but you got to use up context window, like you said, and
Hmm.
even if you have a million token context window, you may still not. It may get lost, right? That when you feed it too
Hmm.
much information.
Yeah, I mean, so there's two things to think about in a context window. Like, so one thing that it comes up a lot is the size of the model. And from my experience, the larger the model, the more it's able to kind of work with that context window. So there's like a working context window that's separate from the official advertised context window. So if you're, so like GPT-5 just came out with, they say 400 tokens, 400K tokens. What is actually like not advertised is that it's actually 272K tokens, because they combine the input and output section. So if the model can reason for a while, it needs
Oh,
to output 100K tokens. So that eats into the available context window. And then if you use like the smaller models like GPT-5 Mini or GPT-5 Nano, they're much smaller. So realistically, you're not going to get much more than maybe 20 or 30K tokens before the model just loses track completely of what you're talking about. Even though you can technically give it all that information, it's not going to do much of value with it.
right, right, right. Well, one thing I found that it's helpful sometimes is, well, in Cloud Code you can compact the entire
Mm-hmm.
chat transcript and then basically get a sort of a summary, or I do a
Mm-hmm.
retrospective with that I then have it look at
Mm-hmm.
if it needs to sort of understand
Mm-hmm.
what we did to continue on. Do you have any other tips like that to help
Yeah,
with that?
so if I'm using Claude Code, one thing I'll have it do when I get to the very end of the context window is I'll try and have it write as much of information as it can into a documentation file, into
Hmm.
a markdown file, so it doesn't get lost in the thread. Compacting can help, but it has a lot of spurious information, like, oh, I read this file and this file and this file, and that's not like super helpful, but it'll know like where to look for certain things, and it'll summarize some parts of your logic. But like if it just read an important piece of documentation with a tool, it's not going to have that piece of documentation in its summary. So like being able to like remind it where to look for certain things, I think that's the key thing, is when you're starting a fresh conversation, is just knowing where to look for what information to get that information. I think it's like a brilliant trick.
Well, and I think to that aspect, then that means really staying organized, right? Because
Hmm.
I've actually helped clean up projects that it's a nightmare because they just
Hmm.
let the AI do whatever. And there was
Hmm.
no organization. There were
Hmm.
JavaScript files everywhere. There were markup
Hmm.
files or Markdown files everywhere. There was nothing to be organized where it said, I have logic here, like you mentioned,
Hmm.
logic, and you have view controllers, then you have your HTML here. I mean, I think
Hmm.
one of the things that it's important is to guide the AI into some sort of organization, right, with your
Hmm.
code when you're creating
Yeah.
this.
Absolutely. Yeah, like if it's intuitive for the model to go find that information, I think that's like an important thing. And like if that's why it's also interesting to work with models. Like I'm building tools for the models with like Repo Prompt's MCP server, which we can get into in a bit. But
Hmm.
the main thing in building that is that I'm building tools that are consumed by the AI model. And so when I'm working on them, I'm asking the model, okay, what is intuitive for this pattern here in this description or this layout of the function, so that like you would use it in a way that made sense to you. And asking it these questions, it can be like, oh well, I didn't know what that auto parameter meant, so I didn't trust it, so I didn't want to use it. And you can get these kinds of information and insights from the model. So having to like build your tools around how the model's using it, and then watching it use it too, and then adjusting it so that it can catch patterns that it might do erroneously, that's like super important too. So,
Yeah,
and
and
that comes
having
to
a
the layout
simple
of your code.
yeah,
Yeah,
and having a simple markdown file sometimes that guides the AI
it can help.
agent, right? It can
Yeah.
definitely help.
Yeah, but the thing I'm finding with Claude Code as well is that it's got very strong prompting, and even if you put very clear things in the Claude MD Mark file, it doesn't really always respect it, and it doesn't always read it. And I think they prompted Anthropic to kind of sometimes ignore what it is that you've asked it to do, which is unfortunate. And that's actually one of the things that a lot of folks are actually really liking with GPT-5, is that it really listens to instructions a lot more clearly. But that's a double-edged sword. So if you don't know what you're doing, you kind of want the model to take a bit of the lead. But if you do, then that's perfect, because you're getting that scalpel precision for what you asked for. But sometimes, if you don't know what you're asking for, then it's not right. So it's not
But
great.
I'm wondering if there is an in between there where you tell it
Hmm.
what you want, but also put in the prompt
Hmm.
somehow that if I'm wrong at what, because I actually, one thing I found that you need to do with your AI agents, it's ask it to challenge you. Not to
Yeah.
say, "Yay, that's a great idea," because it always comes back with like, "That's a
Hmm.
wonderful implement." I always
Hmm.
say, "Feel free to disagree with me. Challenge me if this is incorrect," because I don't want an echo chamber, right? Because you could
Hmm.
be implementing it wrong, and just literally saying, "Challenge me on this." I think
Hmm.
it prompts it enough for it to tell you, "Hey, that's a great idea. However, here's a different way of implementing it." Right? At a minimum, do you have some other tips like that for that?
Yeah. So I find sometimes the models are trained to be really like they value what the user says above all else. And so even when you tell it to challenge you, sometimes it won't quite do that.
Right.
What I have found is interesting though is if you say, this other AI model wrote this, what do you think of it? It seems to treat AI model responses in a much lower grade of quality than it does what the human says. And it's much happier to kind of poop on it than it is
That's
for what
interesting.
you said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. So there was a thing that I did, which was I was testing out hooks and seeing
Hmm.
how they worked. And one thing I did was after a document was created, I had the hook call a different AI model through the
Hmm.
API, pass it the document, the Plan MD document, and give it feedback. So it was
Hmm.
literally going outside of that AI
Hmm.
agent, right? Is in Amazon Kiro and going outside of it into Gemini, and then coming back to Kiro and saying, "Hey, this is what I see wrong with it."
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
found it like that it kind of also took that more to heart as well.
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean that's definitely a good approach, a good idea. I think the thing to watch out though is if you just give it a blank document, or I mean that document with no other context, it either needs the ability to go fetch the information it needs to build context around that plan,
Right.
or you give it sufficient direction on where to look for the information that complements the plan to understand the context around it. And I think that's the key thing with it, with all AI coding, is it's all about context. Like if and especially if you're using sub agents, which can get complex, like they don't generally have enough context to kind of do all the same work, because they don't know what you've discussed in the chat, and they only know what the other model who prompted them tells them. Or if you're using a hook, like whatever you put in your script are going to go get it. So having ways of syncing context between these models and these different chats, like that's like a huge thing, and that's one of the things that I'm working on with Repo Prompt, is that context management.
So let's talk about a little bit about you mentioned before forking the chat, right? You were talking
Yeah,
about
forking
before.
in the chat.
Explain that what that means, because that's an interesting concept that I haven't heard
Mhm.
before. And so explain what you meant by that.
Oh yeah, so there's all kinds of ways to work with chats, and I think when you're working with AI models, you can get very creative with flows of information. So like a general back and forth is the way that most people think of a chat. Like you start with a message, you get a response, you have another message. Sometimes you have two messages and then a response, but you'll never have two responses in a row because AI models don't work unprompted. Um, though with agents, they're kind of prompting
Right.
themselves to keep going, which
Right.
is kind of where that goes. But then what a fork does is that it takes a point in the conversation and then like you can go back in time and then start a different thread from that point. And then so you can kind of like clip off a part of the end of the chat history. You're like, okay, well, at this point it went off track, or at this point I need to kind of ask some follow-up questions, but I don't want to pollute the context. So let's kind of take a detour here, fork it into this new direction, and then keep chatting there. And then you can find some information and kind of go back into the main thread. If you're using Claude Code, what you can do is you can hit escape twice, and then it lets you kind of go through the message history. You can kind of go back up and then hit enter at a point that you're happy with, and then the conversation will then split off from that point. In Repo Prompt, I have a special, like just a button that does that. If you want to go even more intense, there's this thing called a loom, which some people get into. I've not really gone that deep into it, but like you can imagine like a tree structure where like your branch, you can visualize all the branches at once and kind of pick off and go into different places. And some folks really like that, but that's just like it's not the kind of way that I work mostly. But yeah, you can get really creative with it.
Yeah, yeah. So let's circle back to the original question, which was,
Mm-hmm.
is a code a thing of the past? Of course it is, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously that was just to get more people to show up, and they did. No. But I mean, obviously it isn't. It's still important, right? Even if we don't pay that much attention to it, it's still very important. But Amazon is a big pusher with Kira of the spec-driven development, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big pusher of that as well. I have my own framework called Vive Docs that
Mm-hmm.
people can get on my site. It's free, open source. But let's talk about that, because it isn't a thing of the past, but it's definitely less important, right?
It depends. The way that I work, like I'm often working, so you mentioned, spec-driven development. That's definitely one way to go about it. The way that I go about it is a lot more focused on, out like I don't want to focus overly on the outcome. Like I focus on I have this part of the code that I want to mutate. I want to change this to do something different, and I'm very deliberate with I need this to happen. Like often there's times where you're working on a brand new feature where you don't need to think that way, and a spec is a great way to kind of go off and just build it out and then come back to the code after. But like if I'm working on an issue and a bug or something, like a spec is not going to help you solve the bug. It's going to not be able to like it's not going to be able to understand from the spec, how the code should work so that it's functional. You need to kind of think through the code of this part talks to this part, and then there's an issue here, a race condition or a deadlock happening. I need to look at the code and ask it to kind of change how this code functions. And so I'm prompting about the code and not the outcome. And so there's different ways to kind of work through it, but it comes down to what you're working on. So like a bug fix is very different from a new feature, and even a new feature you want to kind of integrate it into an existing system, and so you do need to have the awareness of the existing system when you're asking it. And maybe that comes into the spec, but there's like a technical spec, there's a product spec, like the
Right.
architecture. Like in a company, you're thinking through all of these pieces. You have different roles for each part, and this can kind of get blurry, especially as you're kind of just the engineer with the spec and you're kind of going to the output. But like you do need to take the step to kind of turn this into architecture before you kind of go straight to the implementation.
Right, right. And I think that's where in my documentation framework, we start with planning. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
starting a new project, the bug is totally different. We started with project, you start with planning. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
discover the idea, you iterate through it, you create a PRD, then you create a plan out of that, and then from there you go and start working on that
Mm-hmm.
into and iterate right through
Mm-hmm.
versions, sprints, whatever you want to do it, and you do it
Mm-hmm.
in small chunks. And I'm glad you said something you said that nobody talks about, which is bugs. Everybody talks
Mm-hmm.
about vibe coding as I create stuff. I can create, I
Mm-hmm.
can create, I can create in 5 minutes. Yes, you're right. But then you have to live with it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if it's going to be like you've done a productions app that you're selling, right, that people use,
Mm-hmm.
so you have to live with it. So
Mm-hmm.
you're definitely going to get bugs, whether it's written by AI or humans. You're going to get bugs.
Hmm.
That's probably where code becomes extremely important. Maybe the
Hmm.
creation part, it's more in the background, right? Where I'm focusing more on the spec, the interaction between the things, but still all spec driven. But when you get into running and into, oh, I'm having some scalability issues or I'm having some
Hmm.
bugs, that's where it becomes really important, I would imagine.
Yeah. And like earlier in my development of this app, I was less familiar with Swift's like various issues, and concurrency is like a huge topic in Swift. And the more that I worked, the more I ran into issues with it. And then I had to learn and figure out what the right practices are. And I learned a lot. And now when I work on new features, that's why I spend a lot more time paying attention to the code and to the architecture, because I know what works and what doesn't, and I want to avoid the bugs before they happen. And so you can kind of go off in the deep end and just like let it kind of do its thing. But if you do, then you, like you said, you have to live with it, and then you have to spend a lot more time fixing it afterwards. So there's this preventative flow you can do, which is to be involved and look at the code and understand what it's doing and help guide it and talk to the model. The models are getting better all the time, and they're
Yeah.
going to make better choices. But then you're still in this place where they don't have all the information. For one, they can't see your entire code base once it gets large enough at one time. And then for two, it's that they don't have all the latest information from your frameworks. There's also dependencies that they don't see. Like if you're working on a website, there's probably 100 packages in there that it's not seeing. So it doesn't know what each one of them does, and it doesn't know how each of them mix with each other. And so like you have to start, finding, well, first of all, you have to start testing, and testing is super important, and finding ways to write reliable tests that aren't just, testing fluff is important. So there's all kinds of practices you can do to try and prevent them before you ship them. But like you do have to stay involved, and you do have to be patient, and to try and like take the time it takes to make sure that things are stable before you move forward, rather than just being happy that the button does what you think it does.
Yeah.
And then when you add another button, does the first button still work? That's a whole thing that you have to check
Right.
too. So,
And can it
yeah,
work by it when 1,000 people click on that button, not just you
yeah,
clicking it one time?
hmm,
So,
exactly.
um, you touched upon testing.
Hmm.
Explain, like, there's test driven development, right? Maybe explain a little bit
Hmm.
about testing and why that's important. And what we're covering here, just for those that are non-developers, is we're talking about the software development lifecycle. We pretty much
Hmm.
talked about all of those cycles there that are really important. And this is, everybody's playing around right now with AI, right? They're vibe coding and but it's going to come to a point where it becomes a really critical application and you want to make money with it. You will
Hmm.
have to do everything we spoke about today here. You won't be able to get away from it. You won't be able just to, what was there was an app that was it the T something app that had a huge issue. I forgot the name of it, but they had some huge privacy issues. I think it's okay. We have your dog that wants to get involved in this conversation here. That's okay. He has his own opinion. Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
no, no
yeah.
worries.
So so just in terms of testing, just to get a little bit into it, like one
Yeah,
thing that you'll get a lot with writing your code is if you set like if a lot of AI agents now, they can use the terminal and they can run tests themselves and they can
right.
validate them. So you want to guide them through when you're building a feature to think through how can I test it too. And so this is something that I've actually started doing more now. Is when I'm working on a system, I'm like, okay, like it's working on like a file system, but like how can I make this testable without the file system? Well, you can create like a mock file system. And so being able to engineer your code in such a way that you can pass in mock data so that you can test that it does what it says without kind of like testing isolated pieces that don't represent the full picture. So you want to really try and as much as possible like represent the actual live interactions that it will have, which is not always easy to do. So you have to spend some time thinking about the architecture of your testing and your data, and that comes back to like these patterns that we were talking about, where you're trying to think about isolating the parts of your code from each other so that it's not all one big ball of mud. It's not just like one big interwoven piece of muck. You want it to be different pieces that are kind of independently testable. And I think the more that you work with AI, the more you need to kind of have these independent pieces. And so, and to an extent where it's like it's actually starting to become more isolated pieces than you would even with normal traditional engineering, because the models, well, for one, they have limited context windows, so you want to have as much as possible of that component to be kind of as small as self-contained as possible so that the whole piece can kind of fit in memory for it. and each of those functionalities are testable, and then you can try and test the other pieces together. It's not always easy to do, and it takes a lot of work to kind of build software this way, but I think that the more you work with AI, the more you need to think about this kind of interplay of pieces, so that you can make sure they're reliable.
And I think what you're saying is you don't have to pay attention to all the trees, but you definitely have to understand the forest and be an architect and understand how
Hmm.
things are. That's why I'm a big pusher of that too, right? It's with
Hmm.
vibe coding, it's not about all the code, getting nitty gritty and understanding every piece of line, but definitely understanding the architecture and how they relate to each
Hmm.
other because that's what's going to make it scalable, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's really, like we were saying, there's three things really, and that's why it always comes back to like this classic pattern of the model view controller is you've got logic, you've got data, and you've got sorry,
The
the
view,
model,
the
the
view,
content, the
logic,
view.
data,
That's
and the
right.
view.
Sorry, I was
Yep.
just yeah, exactly,
View
exactly.
model controller,
Yeah,
right? And yeah.
yeah, exactly. You're showing what you're showing is different than what you're doing, and the data. How does the data fit into it? So you've got to think about the three pieces and how they interconnect. And there's frameworks that handle a lot of it for you now. But like trying to kind of split things off into logical pieces, it generally works quite well. And in games, especially, there's something called entity component systems in games, and it takes that to kind of an extreme where because you're separating out your data from your logic, you're able to kind of scale it up to like going from, so if without it you'd be able to get like 100 objects in a scene kind of intermeshing, but then with it you'd be able to get like 100,000 or a million entities
Mm.
kind of mixing together because you're able to do all of it in parallel. And so like there's these scalability patterns of splitting things off. It has a lot of effects in all kinds of places, and you might not even expect them. So it's good to
Yeah.
think about.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk a little bit about some of the tools that
Hmm.
vibe coders
Hmm.
specifically can use. One of them is obviously the one that you've done. Explain a little bit about Repo Prompt.
Hmm.
Why did you create it first of all, and explain how
Yeah.
it works.
So, I was mentioning earlier, I was working with Claude Opus at the time when I started, and the big issue back then was how do I get context about my code base into the AI model? And so the first problem I was solving was taking the different files that I was working on but picking the ones that mattered. So I didn't want all of the code because that's too much code. I wanted the ones that mattered to my query, and then give that to the model to iterate on it. And so that was the first problem, was just finding the right context to give to the model. And then the second problem was applying edits. So if I'm working in a chat, I want to not have to copy paste the response. I want to be able to have it just auto apply. And that's something a lot of the agents and cursor and all these tools they solve for you. And so that was one thing that I was able to do. And still to this day, there's a feature where it's just an XML mode where I can go into ChatGPT or into AI Studio, and I can get an XML block response, and I can paste it back in the app, and it auto applies the edits for my review. So that was the big thing, is feeding context and reviewing it. And as I move forward, and as things kind of move on now with AI agents, the context problem still becomes important. So like you mentioned earlier that as you start off with a fresh chat, you're like, the model has amnesia, doesn't know anything about your code base,
Right.
doesn't know anything about your task. So you can write documentation, or you can kind of give it information. And one of the things I built is called a code map. And the code map is a kind of really compressed representation of your files. So it'll
Right.
have like just the functions. If you've worked in C++, there's a header file and a CPP file. And so the logic is in the CPP. The header is just the definitions. It's kind of like a directory of the file. And so I can generate that for different languages. And that makes you able to kind of take like something that would be like 60K or 100K tokens from certain files, push that all the way down to like 5K tokens. And so you can start a chat with information about like all those files, and it gives the model information of what to look for and where. And so that's like a super important thing, is just giving the model the tools to be able to quickly know what to look for, so it doesn't waste its context window finding information that isn't useful. And so that's like a constant problem. And lately, what I've also been able to work on with this MCP setup is this pair programmer setup that I've been using quite a bit lately. And so one of the problems that you have working with AI agents is that they're very expensive. So an AI agent, it basically, every time it prompts itself, it's basically another query. And so there's something called context caching that allows you to kind of reuse some of the tokens you're spending, but it still adds up to more than it would otherwise. And it's doing a lot of queries to kind of get to an answer and to change some code. And so sometimes you might spend $5 when you might have been able to do it with just a few cents otherwise. So what I've done is this pair programmer mode allows a model that's an agent that could be a smaller model to kind of find information for a bigger model to work with.
Hmm.
And so it's able to kind of gather the context of doing this work of picking the right files and then spoon feeding it to the model that is going to solve your problem and just reason about it without having to make any tool calls. So you can have a model that's like O3 Pro that would normally be way too expensive to run in an agent that prompts itself. Just do a one-shot answer, and it doesn't cost you very much at all, and you're able to affordably use that model in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. So being able to pair an agent with kind of like a smarter model and have that synchronized context between them is just like a really interesting way to work. And that's kind of the thing that I'm really pushing forward over the next few months with Repo Prompt.
I love that because it's kind of similar to what I was telling you about having the hook send it to a different model
Mm-hmm.
to, but in this context, that other model will have more information to really be able to challenge it properly, right? Because it has more of
Exactly.
the context. It's been working together.
Yeah, and it has like the continued chat log. So like I do a lot of, in the chat, a lot of grooming of the context. So like you're not re-sending the same files over. You're sending
Yeah.
like the latest version of files. The chat is kind of compressed a little bit. You're not getting, cruft and something called context rot, which we can get into a little bit after. And the model is able to both stay in touch. So the big model has a chat thread, and the other agent can know what it sent to the chat, and it has the same chat thread in memory. So the whole conversation is kind of in sync with both models, and you're able to kind of work through large problems over a longer period of time with them, and even stop one agent and have another one come back, read the chat log, get up to speed with what's been happening, and continue. So that's like a really interesting way to kind of have continuity.
That's pretty crazy. And so you're doing this through an MCP server with your tool?
Yeah, that's right. So there's an MCP server that lets it work with, Cursor, or if you want Kiro or Claude Code, it can do this with it. But I am working on an agent to kind of do this kind of all natively, so it's a lot easier to set up. Like the thing with my tool is right now, we're talking about vibe coding. It is kind of not the target market for vibe coders. It's more for like people who do
Developers.
understand the code. Like it is a bit of a
Yeah.
complex tool. But what my hope is that a lot of the things that I've been building are now usable by AI agents, and it lowers the kind of the like it makes it a lot more accessible for newcomers who are not familiar with the deep engineering concepts, because those AI agents will have the tools that my app builds for the people, but now it's the agents using the tools to kind of help them kind of get forward. So like that's the kind of flow where you're able to get a lot of the benefits that I've been building, but without having to understand the entirety of how the sausage works.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to place your bets on the bigger market, it's going to be the non-developers because I think there's millions and millions of project team members in enterprises and everywhere, right, that are going to be doing a lot of vibe coding, and they're going to need tools to help
Yeah,
them
I
along and do it right.
but on the flip side, there's also a lot of experienced engineers who need, more precision tools than are available on the
True.
market. And that's kind of where I've been going to, is to try and arm those experienced developers with the tools to kind of go as deep as they need to, because, that's a very important segment. And I think that's kind of served me well, and is a bit underserved at the moment because everyone is focusing on vibe coding and making
Right.
it easy. But like not enough folks are trying to pay attention to the scalpel, to the tool that allows them the precision to do what they're trying to do.
See, and I like what you just said, making it easy. But for me, I'm focusing on vibe coders, those technical non-developers, not to make it easy, but to make it
Mm-hmm.
right. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the big thing. I wrote in a blog article today, literally focused on having that we should have a vibe coder advocate slash relations person, right? Kind of like a DevRel
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that pushes best practices, that pushes
Mm-hmm.
documentation, so I think that's really, really important, and we may have that hybrid person. So we're getting pretty close to the end here, but
Mm-hmm.
in your opinion, somebody with zero coding
Mm-hmm.
experience, how important is it for them? Because we've settled code is not a
Mhm,
thing of the past, right? Obviously,
mhm.
but how can they start creating today with vibe coding
Of
and do
course.
something
Mhm.
that is scalable and maintainable for the future?
I mean, it's hard to say about can they make something scalable and maintainable, but they can get started and they can learn and they can try and fail. And I think that's the whole thing is the more you try, the more you know about what doesn't work. And then you can try different things later. And the thing that vibe coding gives you is that it makes prototypes cheap to build, and you can start over. And I think just the takeaway for those folks is to don't be afraid to start over. Like be okay with throwing away code that doesn't work and starting fresh and learning from it. And you can have AI learn like, well, this worked and this didn't. Okay, well, let's write that down and we'll start again. And then your next prototype will be that much better because it won't have those failures that the first one did.
Well, and to that, in the Vive Docs that I do, one of the documentation requirements is a retrospective on every sprint that you finish with AI. You do a retrospective of what worked and what didn't, so that way it knows for the future what not to do. And it could be in general, but it could also be specific to your project, right? Don't do this because we have this library that you can use.
Mm-hmm.
So doing that kind of documentation, I think, is extremely important. To kind of end it here, what do you tell developers, software engineers that said, "Now forget vibe coding. This is not the future." What do you tell them?
I say try building something with it. Try building a prototype in a language you've never used in your life, and have it kind of try and build something. A lot of I used to never really be a web dev, so I started with working with vibe coding to build a website, and your first one will suck, and you'll learn from that. So try building, like, the less you know about the framework, the more you get out of vibe coding, and then you can see where it goes, and I think, like, working on a web tech stack is the ultimate vibe coding place because models are just so good at it. If you make like a React website that's like perfectly in the training data, you're going to get all the benefits of the vibe coding, and you're going to be able to have a good time seeing what you can build with just your natural language, just your thoughts. Like, oh, move the button over there, make this smaller, make this effect better. Like, that's the essence of it. Focusing purely on outcomes without looking at the code at all.
What's interesting, back in the day when I did PHP, I did Cold Fusion and other
Mm-hmm.
technologies like that. That's the only thing you focused on, right? You couldn't
Mm-hmm.
jump around. I have apps that I wrote in JavaScript, in Hugo framework. I'm about to publish a Swift native iOS app. This is
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So, for developers that are super awesome at whatever technology, think about
Mm-hmm.
all the other things you've always wanted to do but
Yeah.
weren't able to, and now you can. And like you
Yeah. You
said,
can try things.
you can try things and you can learn through it, right? And especially
Yeah.
if you're a developer, you're going to pick it up so much quicker anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
and it remains addicting. Like, the more you work
it
with
is
AI to
addicting.
build something, like, the more you just, okay, well, one more prompt, like, you just can't
Yes.
stop yourself from seeing how far you can take it.
Yes, my son is into vibe coding, and we went to a 4th of July outing, and I kid you not, he brought his laptop and was running Cloud Code in the background and doing checks while we're looking at the fireworks because he's that addicted to it.
Yeah,
It's not a
it's
joke.
it's
Yeah.
dangerous.
It's dangerous, but it's
Yeah,
wonderful. Wonderful time
yeah,
to be in the tech industry.
mhm,
Anyway,
absolutely.
Eric, it's been wonderful, man. I really appreciate. Good job on the app. Continue much
Thank you,
success on that.
thank you.
Thank you for being here. You have your at PVNCHER
It's like puncher with a V.
puncher with a V. There you go. I like that.
Mhm.
Any other
Yeah.
places that people can get a hold of you?
I mean, that's my handle for most apps. If you go on my website, you can also find my Discord, and it's a great community there. I love the folks in there, and it's a great place to learn. Even if you're not using my app, like, there's a lot of really smart, talented developers working with AI in there that are staying on the bleeding edge. Like, today was a great place with GPT-5 coming out. Like, people were on
Yeah.
the cutting edge of it, and they knew exactly what was going on. It's a great place to follow the news too. So.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big community there, and I think you have a trial, right? Or is it? There's a free version,
Uh,
and
There's a free version. Yeah, if you need a trial or something like that, you can always reach out there. I can make some exceptions. I'm working with Polar, to the payment provider, to kind of get trials kind of set up in
but
the
you had a free
infrastructure there.
version because I started with the free
There is a free
version and then
version.
I bought
Hmm.
the full version.
Yeah.
And totally, if you think because you have cursor and it knows the context, you don't need it. No, because you can use ChatGPT, you can use so much with your tool on top of that. And now with
And even the
all the
free
other
version does
features,
let you do that. Like, the free version lets you
right?
paste stuff all over the place and try all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And if you have questions, I'm always around to help. Like, I do know the app is a little bit overwhelming for new users, especially if you're not an experienced developer. But that's being worked on, and I always try to follow along with people who are struggling as well. So
Well, Eric, thank you so much. I wish you best of luck with your app and everything else. Thank you for being here. I
thank you so
appreciate it.
much. Well,
And thanks for you to be here. I hope you enjoyed it. We had a big turnout, actually. I'm so happy about this. So if you want to get a hold of me, just send me an email, Marcelo at icodewith.ai. Go check out my website, icode.with. I code with .ai. It's a hard one to spit out and say it, actually. But go check it out. I'm going to have more podcasts. I have another one coming up with the program technical manager at Microsoft on from an MCP tool. Lots of upcoming podcast episodes, plus blog articles and a bunch of other stuff there. So please go check it out. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. All that stuff. Click the bell icon to get notified when a new episode is out. If you did enjoy this episode, which I hope you did, hit the like button. If you didn't, send me an email and tell me why. So come back in 2 weeks. Well, I'm going to be doing this every 2 weeks. I hope to see you then, and have a good one, everybody. Cheers.